All right, I think we have a sufficient consensus that we should get on with the conference. We're mindful of the fact that the people with us in cyberspace have not been treated to the catering that has been laid on at tea time, and I think we've used up more time than we wanted to. Our next panel is assembled behind me and is called panel 2 on the program in front of you. So I will stop talking. I do have to confess that I encourage people to bring tea and coffee and food up with them. Just be careful with it because they've just recycled this room and we don't want all of the leftovers trampled into the carpet or whatever. The caterers have been asked to come and collect. So if you pass the used crockery down towards the door side of the room, we'll solve the problem. Those who came late are not in. Oh, yes. The gentlemen, the heads are as close to Nursery Gorge as you can get. And ladies, the fire escape that we use to get to the common room is where your convenience lies. All right, Ben, over to you. And here is a time machine. You can allocate minutes to your speakers as you see fit. We were giving 18 last time. Perhaps we can give 20 this time because we got a free run to lunch now. And same drill, questions in cyberspace in the chat room and questions in the room on paper to be sorted and arranged and passed on to Ben. Over to you, Ben. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity. Many of the discussions we find on a day-to-day basis, and today will go about law, it'll go about theory and what need to happen. But nowhere does it come home. Nowhere does it come home as it does when it comes to whistleblowers, because people's lives are lost. Their livelihoods are lost. And let me just quote a few of them. Babita Dio Quran. 800 million rand was siphoned and she lost her life in the process. She was murdered. We should not put fancy words around that. Matopelo More exposed 200 million rands worth of corruption in the Daybreak farms. Patricia Mashale is a SAPS whistleblower, and she is out in the cold at the moment, suffering severely. The Whistleblower House opened their doors on the 22nd of February last year, and as of Friday, 121 whistleblowers are on our books, of which 103 need legal assistance. Counseling people needed, 43 people needed counseling because of the trauma they suffered, and 19 needed safety and security. These are real figures, these are real people, these are people with families. Let me quote to you something as chilling that has happened up last Thursday. The acting CEO of South African Tourism, Themba Khumalo, said, internal process in terms of the malicious leak, because this was confidential document that has resulted in a breach of employment relations and confidentiality clauses, will be carried out. And whoever the actor is, when he or she is found, will face the relevant remedies, he said. That is in the newspaper. What he actually said on TV is that the person need to be isolated. Now explain to me what does isolated mean? Does that mean the person gets put in a corner, lose their life, lose their job? It is chilling when somebody on TV can say, we need to isolate the person that have leaked the information that could cost this country R1 billion. That is what this topic is about today, is the audacity on public TV to say somebody need to be isolated. And we can interpret isolate as much as we can. My panel today is Malini, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, Govender, Cynthia Stimpel, who is a whistleblower herself, and then Tseliso, ex-human rights, I took my glasses off, former Chief Executive Officer of South African Human Rights Commission. Cynthia, will you get us going?
Thank you very much. Welcome everyone for being here today. To all the organizers, thank you, and to all the attendees. I hope we can create the interest and support for whistleblowers from this forum. In Paul Pretoria's earlier session, he stated about the trends of the current corruption, where one is seeing sabotage, assassination, and the continuous dysfunctionality. When one looks at the thread around that, is the information that we're getting into the media space or as citizens of this country is through whistleblowers. My talk to you today is about the experience of whistleblowers. Okay. To change the slide. So whistleblowing is, no one wakes up to decide to be a whistleblower. It happens only because you, in your job, in your sphere that you're working in, or your experience in your profession, you find that things aren't going right. And you decide to speak to your colleagues or to your seniors and saying, this is going against our policies and procedures. And hence, how can we stop it and how can we fix it? So we do take it to our immediate circles, and we then take it to the more senior levels, and eventually, because no one is listening, one takes it outside. And that's when we came to the definition of whistleblowers. Many people have various definitions of what it entails to be a whistleblower. They call us many names. We are snitchers. We are impempes. We are people who aren't following the protocol. You're supposed to keep quiet if you know something. And then you are ostracized once you speak out. So let's go to the definitions. In the PDA, the Actual Protected Disclosures Act of 2000 and amended 2017 legislation that we have in South Africa, it does not even define the name whistleblowing. The Transparency International, who is a German-based anti-corruption organization, they define it as follows: the disclosure of information related to corrupt, illegal, fraudulent, or hazardous activities being committed in or by public or private sector organizations, which are of concern and they threaten the public interest. And this is to individuals or entities believed to be able to effect this action. So they say that. The next definition comes from the International Labour Organization, and they define it further as saying the reporting by employees or former employees of illegal, irregular, or dangerous practices by employers. The Encyclopedia Britannica defines whistleblower as an individual who, without authorization, reveals private or classified information about an organization, usually related to the wrongdoing or the misconduct. Whistleblowers generally state that such actions are motivated by a commitment to public interest. And there we have it in this definition that the case that Ben Theron has just mentioned about the recent Tottenham Hotspur's procurement transaction. There's no discussion of we are doing the wrong thing. How should we be spending the money, where the money should best fit in this country, but rather that CEO is saying, we've got to find that whistleblower, we've got to hound him out, and we're going to hold him to account for disclosing supposedly confidential information. Further definitions regarding a whistleblower is that these terms were first used in early years around either mismanagement in government or through wastage and corruption. And it covers any activity now that which affects public offices or a public entity or private organizations. And this is more about the public interest, where it could result in wastage, in corruption, in fraud, or any self-seeking or profit-seeking, as we would call it. So to mention a few whistleblowers on the international global scale, which you may know of, Daniel Ellsberg, who was the whistleblower where they called him Deep Throat, Watergate. Then Edward Snowden, he whistleblew on the NSA and the CIA, who were getting young, savvy people, technological people in to build systems where they firstly told them that they should build the systems for spying on China, but the systems were actually used to spy on the people in their own country, in the USA. So you can imagine if the USA is doing it and China is doing it, what is happening in our country at present. And then Mark Felt, Chelsea Manning, Catherine Gunn, who came across an email. If you've ever watched a story, Official Secrets, where she came across an email where the discussion was happening about the Gulf War. And they were trying to hide that information. And she realized this was something wrong and she needed to do something about it. And then John Chitongo, Kenya, who took a position in government, in an anti-corruption department that was formed to prevent corruption, and yet corruption continued. And he did something very brave, where he taped his entire body with recording machines, wore this jacket, and he attended these meetings to record all the corruption discussions. When he tried to, initially when he tried to challenge it, he realized that they are still going to go on unabated. And that's when he started recording the information, which he took to London. In South Africa, we have many, and I could not even name them on this list, more for time that we're constrained with. Martha Nangoya, who recently won her award from the PRASA, and the board of PRASA is still deciding on it. And then others like Masilo, Matepo, Ethel Williams, Suzanne Daniels, Bianca Goodson. What is the lived experience of a whistleblower? There are many. We are ostracized in society. We are continuously harassed. There's spreading of rumors. There's threats and reprimands. You are threatened your life, your job, your families, your children. We are blocked in many ways from getting new jobs. You cannot take a transfer, or you cannot apply for a new job. You are blacklisted because you're unable to work, and therefore you suffer with a bad credit record. And many of us have lost our lives. The ones who have lost our lives recently, Babita Deokaran, who's been mentioned, Pena Moreau, and more recently, a few others in our country of the Abatlali, Machanzongo area. What lessons have we learned from whistleblowing? And this is why there's been many webinars and discussions around what can we do to assist whistleblowers and support them if they are constantly being treated as pariahs and there's a stigma attached to them, and that many people do not want to hire them. I was recently invited to speak on the radio a week ago, asking why is that whistleblowers cannot get jobs. And it's because they are treated in the manner and that society still has a stigma against them. But in our recent Zondo report, he's come up with quite a number of key recommendations, and so has many other organizations like PLAF and Corruption Watch and PARI. And I've just put them all together. What have we learned, and how can we then encompass them into our legislation and into our social environment? The one is by creating an independent whistleblower regulatory authority, like an ombudsman, where everyone can bring their complaints there and they manage there, and they done in a manner that the whistleblower's anonymity is protected. Their name should not be out in the media, where people can judge them and where people can then find methods of attacking them. Then adopting a strict and obligatory timetables for processing and acting on the protected disclosures. We need to amend the Protected Disclosures Act sooner than later. I think it was earlier when Ian Farlam said, or it was Professor Kachalia, it's yesterday. There isn't time. We need to do it now. We need to establish punitive sanctions for breaches of the PDA. Currently, this is not in place. So board members, executive members who are in organizations who are going undeterred victimizing whistleblowers, they are not being attended to. Providing full legal immunities to whistleblowers. Then changing labor legislations and regulations for that, and to allow a fair remedy. So it means one needs to investigate first before you attack the whistleblower and for them to lose their jobs. So the Protected Disclosures Act states that there should be no occupational detriment. But that's the first action that is taken to all whistleblowers. And here we need to use that time and effort to make sure that if we're going to be fair, it's to allow that I'm almost done. Thank you. Allow that the investigations are done first before judgment is done. Then we need to establish mechanisms of safeguarding whistleblowers' physical safety, as well as their mental and physical health. So from a safety perspective, we've seen that whistleblowers are threatened and have been killed. From a mental health perspective, just doing all the work we're doing with Whistleblower House, and from all stories of people having published their own books, that whistleblowers have suffered a traumatic experience. And with that, they do need counseling. This needs to be built into the legislation because it's not there. And then there needs to be protection for the families and for their colleagues and for their societies. And there needs to be the financial support. And here the recommendation we have is that to create a whistleblower support fund, whereby monies are put in there to support whistleblowers in their individual right and what they need. Because the recent stories that broke out about Martha Pello Moray is she's lost everything. Many others like Dr. Masimba Dawa have lost their homes. They are unable to ever work and have a decent home to live in. So the Whistleblower Fund is supposed to support all these needs. Thank you.
Thank you. Malini Govender is the regional head specialized crime unit in the Western Cape. And I'm hoping in a talk, she'll just cover the difference between a whistleblower and a witness, because sometimes we use the words interchangeably and it's not necessarily true. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben, and to my esteemed colleagues on this panel. I think we must give tribute to whistleblowers. Whistleblowers are key in any fight to anti-corruption. What's very clear is this piece of legislation that we use to protect or deal with whistleblowers has as its aim to create a culture in which will facilitate the disclosure of information. However, we've seen that this is anything but what it is sought to achieve. So we can accept, and it's welcomed that our Minister of Justice called this an outdated piece of legislation. Within this context, one needs to understand that we need to ensure that there is much wider protection and much wider leeway given to whistleblowers with lesser restrictions on what it is that they can disclose and the circumstances under which they can disclose. That's as a starting point. And I start with this primarily because it feeds in directly into what Prof. Feroz Kachalia started with. The aim is to deal with systemic corruption, The aim is to change how the whole of society addresses corruption. And with accepting that your starting point is to create this culture where people are free to speak about their experiences, what it is they viewed and what it is that they've experienced within the work environment, is critical to us detecting corruption. Now, international studies and specifically work that is done within the OECD space dealing with corruption, and specifically corruption where foreign bribery is concerned. So this is companies in countries that domestically seem to be completely on par when it comes to having a great anti-corruption agenda and not having their public officials being corrupted, but their companies go into other jurisdictions, and in those other jurisdictions end up corrupting public officials in order to get huge contracts and lots of profits as a result. What was seen by the OECD is that self-reporting and whistleblowing were the greatest detectors of corruption. The trend was that you'd see that when self-reporting started becoming a trend, there was a drop with whistleblowing. But prior to self-reporting getting this high levels of detection, you saw that whistleblowing was where critically the detection came from. Now, what that did was change the way in which those countries dealt with corruption, the way in which companies dealt with corruption. So they got ahead of the corruption by self-reporting rather than waiting for whistleblowers. And that tells you what the potential is that we have. So if we are in a space and place to ensure that we deal with our whistleblowers more effectively, we'll be in a space where we can actually ensure that we change the narrative where it comes to corruption, especially where companies are concerned. Ms. Stimpel has dealt with all the challenges that there are and what we need in terms of the legislation. What clearly from our side is, and to support the Zondo Commission recommendation, an independent agency. What we've seen in practice is that there is a severe level of distrust internally to report. People accept that the minute they report internally, it's guaranteed that they will be victimized. And I think just about every instance that we've seen playing out in the public space speaks to this being a real fear, a reality that whistleblowers are dealing with. The next aspect is they don't necessarily want to come and testify in respect of the matters. So this is the difference that you have between witnesses and whistleblowers. Whistleblowers give you information. They give you information which should be investigated, verified, and acted upon. Our current legislation does not put any obligation on an employer to investigate allegations that whistleblowers have raised. So they can do exactly what it is that we've seen, violate the act, and at the end of the day, victimize these persons. So this information going to an independent agency that deals with the investigation of the preliminary aspects of the allegations, and then at a very early stage involves law enforcement. We've heard the issue of collaboration, cooperation. Now, when you're dealing with something like corruption, the early identification of the matter and parallel investigations are critical to us turning around the long timelines that there are for investigations. So you need to have that in place with whatever it is that we decide to do and how we craft this entire whistleblowing regime. Having ensured that there is this process, and currently just to tell you how we in the short term have addressed this. So you'll find whistleblowers not wanting to report internally, but they are prepared to come in many instances to law enforcement and sometimes even to us in the NPA. Now, in the NPA, dealing with matters in the Specialized Commercial Crime Unit, we do not have investigative powers. But we do partner very effectively with the SIU, and we partner with the Public Protector's Office. So we ensure that we create that safe environment for that witness, for that whistleblower to be in a position to go through to the Public Protector's Office or the SIU and facilitate that interaction. And I think the best example that we saw of the role that law enforcement, whistleblowing, and investigation of this can play is what happened during COVID. With SIU having the proclamation upfront relating to PPEs, people felt a lot more freer to go to SIU with disclosures. And as a result of such disclosures, they were able to immediately act upon it rather than waiting for a proclamation. So they were able to act on it. And as a result, we saw a lot more cases coming into our space for us to be able to deal with the procurement PPE fraud a lot more effectively. So having said that we need this type of relationship that is in place, we have to then also accept that whistleblowers should not, or you should build your investigation around the information that we receive rather than make whistleblowers witnesses. A witness is a person that testifies in court. They give a statement under oath. In some instances, because in order to protect their identity, we will withhold the identity of the witness until the time that they testify. A whistleblower is somebody that will give information, and it's not dissimilar to the informant systems. We currently have the informant system with those huge budgets in the police service, which allow informants to be rewarded for positive information that they give. And yet with our whistleblowers, we do not have a similar system in place. So that's another aspect that we need to start looking with our legislation and our architecture around whistleblowers. So with a positive result, whether it's a finalization of the case or the finalization of an investigation, there should be some incentive to at the end of the day, allow these persons to get on with their lives, especially in instances where they have been victimized for coming forward with these allegations. Now, in them coming forward with these allegations, with them being victimized and losing their jobs, we currently expect them in terms of the legislation to actually approach a court. Litigation is expensive. If you cannot, like Ms. Morey, provide the roof over your head and for your children, how do we expect them to litigate? So whatever legislation we put in place, whatever architecture we have, has to address what the impact is on whistleblowers. I think the last aspect that we need to ensure where it comes to whistleblowers and why this independent agency is so necessary for us is to ensure that whistleblowing does not become politically weaponized, which is another aspect that we are seeing happening in the space. And this is especially so in the municipalities. Now, if you look at Protected Disclosures Act, it covers disclosures to cabinet members, it covers disclosures to provincial MECs, but it's completely silent as to where somebody in a municipality should be going when they, at the end of the day, detect fraud or corruption. So the independent agency, once again, or independent authorities such as SIU, the Public Protector's Office, is the best place for us to be looking at having the system working. So one of the things that we can actually do in our awareness is encourage whistleblowers to make use of these entities. One of the challenges that we have in the system is the proliferation of agencies, the proliferation of spaces and places that people can report to, that as a result, it creates confusion when somebody is dealing with a complaint and they want to go somewhere when they know that they cannot deal with it internally. So we need to see how best we harness where the best practices are. Currently, whilst we're waiting for the agency, whilst we are waiting for a new piece of legislation to deal with this. And I think our message has to be, use the independent agencies. Use the agencies that have got investigative powers to be able to go into an environment and investigate the allegations that are made. We need then also to ensure that if a matter cannot be proved any other way except through the evidence of the whistleblowers, that room is created for these whistleblowers to come into our witness protection program. The reality is that when you approach whistleblowers, They're not interested in getting into the witness protection program because they do not want to testify. And we have to respect that. Oftentimes, they may not be the best witness to testify, and we should not be creating a situation where whistleblowers have to understand that the minute you start making an allegation, that it automatically follows that there is testimony and your statement has to be obtained. So let us craft that way. And from us in law enforcement, we've tried to see, especially here in the Western Cape, how it is we craft our investigations around that. But ultimately, you find that the starting point is, do you want to go into witness protection? Obviously, that is the best option with any person that is to be a witness in a matter. In the sense of whistleblowers, you can also go into witness protection if they at any stage are subject to a disciplinary inquiry. And if they feel that as part of any of those processes, they are going to be, their livelihood is, or their lives are going to be subject to threat, their families are going to be subject to threat, that's an option that's available to them. I think that ultimately, if we do not get this right, this first step right in changing the culture, that anything that we put in place thereafter is that much more difficult. But if the starting point is that whistleblowers have a space, place, and are exalted in our communities rather than being punished, as we've heard, it changes the culture automatically. People start being a lot more observant of their conduct and ensuring at the end of the day that they toe the line as well. Companies then start dealing with things differently. They understand that they have to, that if they don't come forward first and foremost to deal with detecting, preventing, and also most importantly, reporting, that somebody else is going to do it. And if we have achieved one thing, we've achieved a lot in just this one aspect. Thank you.
Thank you, Malini. Tseliso, over to you.
Thank you. Is it on? Hello? Okay. Thank you for the opportunity. My input was going to be around how we create a conducive environment for whistleblowers in our country. But I do want to concur with what my colleagues have said on this topic. So I will not repeat many of the things which they have said. I was just reminded what was said more than 22 years ago by the late Arthur Chaskelson in the case of South African Association of Personal Injury Lawyers versus Heath and others. He said briefly, if allowed to go unchecked and unpunished, corruption and maladministration will pose a serious threat to our democracy. That was many, many years ago. And it looks like we never listened, because at this point in time, this country is dying due to corruption and maladministration, ESCOM, potholes all over the show. And yet, when we talk about measures to fight corruption, certainly whistleblowing is one of the most effective ways in which we can deal with corruption. But since the act was passed in 2000, as colleagues have pointed out, we have seen systematic victimization of whistleblowers in all forms. And then you start wondering, what does it say? Are we confused? Are we mad or what? On one hand, we talk about democracy, government for the people, by the people for the people. We talk about fighting corruption. And yet, those who are at the forefront of fighting corruption are victimized, not just by ordinary people, but by the state using public resources, and by officials who've taken an oath that they will protect the people of this country. And therefore, victimization, apart from its negative impacts on the fight against corruption, it's also a violation of human rights. So where are those who are meant to protect human rights in our country as we speak, as far as the whistleblowers are concerned? So there's definitely a lot of work which needs to be done. I just want to mention one of the things which really saddens me about the victimization of whistleblowers is the lack of support. Many of them, when they get victimized, they have to fight their own cases, whether it's CCMA or labor court, which takes sometimes 3, 4 years, 5 years before people can get justice. Look at the SARS case. Colleagues were fired in SARS. They spent 5 years at home. They win the case, SARS appealed. It was only when some of us intervened that actually SARS apologized to those people and took them back. It's one of the biggest state agencies victimizing whistleblowers in the name of what? So, I mean, whilst at the commission, we've had to go to court to defend whistleblowers, spending millions of taxpayers' money in court. We win sometimes, we don't even get costs. And basically, this shows that we as a state, as a republic, we are confused as far as our understanding of the role of whistleblowing and its importance and what should be done to protect whistleblowers. So we have made it very clear the act is outdated. It's a very useful act, but silly act in other ways, because it only confines whistleblowing in that sense to those who are employed and those who are consultants. What about ordinary South Africans? Someone who's running a spaza shop. What happens if you see corruption? Where do you go? Where do you get protected? And 22 years later, we have not even done much. Now we hear, of course, that the Minister of Justice, thanks God, will be submitting a proposal by end of April this year to see how the legal framework could be amended. That's great. But guess what? There's been very little consultation between us who are involved with civil society and government. I'm excluding you, Prof, that we have met with NACEC, but where is the state? Why is there no consultation between us as citizens of this country and government about things which really matter to us as a republic? So that's something which has to stop. So in the little time I have, let me just rush quickly towards because I'll also talk about short-term interventions and long-term interventions. So as far as short-term interventions are concerned, we demand the following, and I'm glad my colleagues from Public Service Commission are here. We want an immediate end of victimization by whistleblowers by organs of state and state officials. It's happening day in, day out. And we never understand this. We know the Public Service Commission did a study in 2014 and raised some of these concerns. But again, that report is gathering dust somewhere. And we really fail to understand what must we do then as citizens to stop the victimization of whistleblowers by the state using our taxes to protect the republic and to fight against corruption. And yet we must listen here on TV saying, well, comrades, we're fighting corruption, we'll do everything to fight corruption. And yet the very same people who talk about that are the ones who are victimizing whistleblowers or turning a blind eye to the victimization of whistleblowers. We also want financial legal support for whistleblowers who are challenging their victimization in courts and tribunals. Many colleagues who have gone to the CCMA spent billions of rands in legal fees. We took the case of Mr. Obilana to court. He was a teacher whistleblowing about sexual harassment by teachers in Mpumalanga. He gets fired, wins a case to be reinstated. Government, guess what? Appeals. So we took up the cases commission. We lost in the labor court. We paid a couple of million rands. We then appealed to the Labor Court of Appeal. And last year, September, October, when I left the commission, I was told the judge presidents advised our client to settle because government will take this matter to the Constitutional Court and there's no money. So Mr. Bilana is staying at home. 5 years later, no job, nothing, as we speak. We took the case of Mr. Zulu to court, witness protection. We sued the president and the Minister of Justice and the Minister of Police. We won, we didn't get cost. Mr. Zulu was put in witness protection, he ran away. Still in hiding up until now, despite being shot over 40 times as a witness to the killing of Mr. Councillor, ANC Youth League Councillor, some time ago in Pietermaritzburg. So those are some of the issues which we're talking about, the victimization of whistleblowers. Number 3, would like to see the Chapter 9 institutions, including my own commission, really playing a greater role in supporting whistleblowers who are being victimized by the state or anybody else. Public Protector, Human Rights Commission, Most of the people we meet, they say, well, when they take matters to the public protector, they'll be told, no, this matter falls under CCMA or Labor Court. Human Rights Commission, the same story. We battled in the commission to take Mr. Bilana's case to court because we're told it's a labor court and we don't deal with labor matters. That's nonsense. It's a human rights issue. But you can imagine how many cases have these two bodies taken up to fight for whistleblowers who are being victimized by the state or by private sector. And number four, we would like to see greater media campaigns by GCIS and SABC on the need and importance of whistleblowing in the country. We don't see it. And yet we know as South Africans, the moment we are able to mobilize our people against a just cause, we can see a difference. So we need to get this country burning with support for whistleblowers, with whistleblowing against corruption, because corruption is killing our country. We're losing over 50 billion rands a year due to corruption. That's why there are no schools, no health hospitals, potholes, but at the same time, we are not tackling or tapping on those resources where our people can really get involved. There must be support for civil society organizations which are supporting the work of whistleblowers. Many of us do this work from our pockets. Cynthia, Whistleblower House, and many others. Very little support, but we still do it. And colleagues will be aware that for the past 1 year, these colleagues here have been raising the profile of witness protection. That's why today we're sitting here. It's been us with very little support from government. So, and yet, year after year, many government resources are sent back to Treasury because they've not been used, or they get used elsewhere. I won't talk about space. I was told I should skip away from space. Then there's also a need really for an urgent engagement between Department of Justice and whistleblowing organizations. PDA falls under Department of Justice, but in the past 20 years, or let me not say that, past 2 years, we have not seen any engagement between ourselves and the department. We've written letters to say, can we talk? Nobody talks to us. And then you start wondering, why? Did we forget what Arthur Chapman said? That corruption threatens our democracy. So if we're so concerned about these things, then what are we doing? The fourth one is that we really would like to see some understanding or appreciation of whistleblowing by the judiciary. When we passed PEPUDA, there's a requirement in PEPUDA that no presiding officer should sit over a quality matter without being trained. And yet, when our people appear in courts for whistleblowing, they're told, sorry, we don't understand. You know, it's actually quite sad. There have been a few court cases, of course, like the Cyrus one, where the judge said, well, this is whistleblowing, and whistleblowers must be protected. But guess what? Most of the time when you go in CCMA or labor court, they don't care about whistleblowing. They're concerned about the matter at hand. You've been fired. Full stop. And we need to address this. So if our judiciary and lawyers could also understand that when someone says I'm a whistleblower, everything must stop until you address that issue. But hang on, we don't do that. We get victimized. Yeah. Now, on medium-term issues, do you have 2 minutes? Okay. On medium-term issues, we certainly support the amendment of the PDA. Actually, we have drafted a model law for whistleblowing, which we hope government will consider. We need a much more holistic legal framework, which will address and encourage whistleblowing. It also includes incentives. I'm glad you talked about, the budget given by the police for informers. They get paid lots of money, but we're not even paying whistleblowers for fight for exposing corruption. Why not? So again, how do you reconcile these two? It's okay for informants to go and be paid by the police for spying on crime, on criminals. But when whistleblowers expose corruption, nothing happens to them. They don't even get paid, they actually get punished. So in some countries, there is incentive. So if we were to look at the amount of savings which we have had through whistleblowing, and yet we don't even give them a cent, I mean, that's crazy, with due respect. There's therefore a need for a special fund by government with the support of private sector to support whistleblowing in all the aspects. We've had community policing, we fund it. Why do we have community policing? Why do we have informers, but nothing for whistleblowing? I mean, that's silly. Then, of course, there is a need for the creation of some independent body which will address. Of course, there'll be a debate around this, Chapter 9 or whatever. But at this point in time, we're saying there are Chapter 9 bodies for the past 20 years or even more. We don't see their role in supporting of whistleblowers. So if they cannot play that role, despite all talks and stuff like that, then maybe there must be a reform of these bodies so they can actually play a greater role. And therefore, maybe we do need another body which can basically be much more sensitive to the issues at hand. Number 4, the AG. At least now with my experience in government, every year, organs of state must comply with the legal compliance reports to the AG about how they're complying with the legislation which applies to them. But guess what? Very few government departments talk about how they comply with PDA in their legal compliance reports. So the AG must also look into this thing and ask these questions. Number 5, would love to see the Department of Justice producing an annual report on PDA. What are we doing with whistleblowing? Where are they? What's happening to them? And what needs to happen? And this report must be discussed in Parliament. We demand a parliamentary debate on whistleblowing if we are serious about fighting corruption. Thank you.
Let me challenge one of the points you made at the end here that says a special fund must be made available. Who will manage that special fund? And if you look at, previous speakers spoke about Chapter 9 institutions being repurposed. If you look at the SAPS safe houses that are being abused financially, money gets siphoned off. Where will that special fund lie in your mind?
Well, the talk is that, in view of everything you have mentioned before, that we should be very careful how we set up this panel and this fund. It definitely has to be, managed by people who are independent across public and private, and it must be funded by both government and the private sector. But certainly, in view of the experiences, we should make sure we have very good mechanisms to ensure that there's no capture. There's also accountability to this fund. There must be full transparency because it's actually for the people of this country, and not see this fund meeting some of the same fates which other funds have experienced before due to corruption and abuse and capture and all sorts of ills. Thanks.
A question to the panel. Would an informal ombud for whistleblowers using retired judges established immediately to bridge the legislative gap and hiding the identity of whistleblower preserving confidentiality work? The panel, no particular person.
Let me start on that one. Look, something urgent has to be done. And that has been our concern, that, we don't know how long the amendments of laws will take. This country has had a history of taking forever to pass laws. And therefore, while we support a much more holistic legal framework, but something has to happen now. And therefore, that kind of a measure which, can be in interim, it could work. A retired judge helping, that's fine. But we basically want anything viable which will help the plight of whistleblowing and also help us to fight corruption in a much more effective manner while still waiting for the long-term measurements which will take place. We don't even know when. Even, for example, the minister was supposed to come up with a bill at the end of April, which we haven't seen. How long will that take to go through Parliament?
So I think the important part is whatever it is that we decide to develop, it has to be something that first and foremost is in a position to ensure the protection of these whistleblowers, but not only protect the whistleblowers, be in a position to ensure that aspects are effectively investigated. So with having an informal ombud, we need to ensure that the measures that are in place in order to access law enforcement and or agencies such as SIU or the public protector are in place through that relationship in order to ensure that we get the benefits of the whistleblowing occurring. The next aspect would be, what would the role, function, and duties of that ombud be? That ombud would have to have teeth. That ombud would have to be in a position to issue out sanctions against private companies or government departments where there's been a breach of the whistleblower confidentiality or any aspects in respect of the Act. So in crafting it, in saying that it's an informal ombud, those types of aspects need to be spoken of. So perhaps what we actually need is, like we had with the Zondo Commission, we had the president who at the end of the day had the terms of reference that were put in place. So we create this ombud with clear terms of reference that cover these aspects for us to start ensuring that the current Act has the teeth and that there are sanctions in place to deal with any breaches.
Thanks. I just want to add that they must have the capability to investigate, like the Zondo Commission did. Thank you.
Malini, a question to you. Does self-reporting increase where NTRs or stronger law enforcement are in place? What is the incentive to self-report?
Well, let's first start. The first incentive to self-report should be that you are complying with your obligations in terms of the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act. Section 34 makes it an obligation at the pain of being sanctioned through criminal processes for failing to report. So any offense involving an amount over 100,000 and an employer or person in a position of authority is obliged to actually report where it involves offenses involving dishonesty. So that should be the first incentive. There is an obligation, a legal obligation to ensure that companies are in fact reporting. Non-trial resolutions and the space where self-reporting becomes relevant where non-trial resolutions are concerned is that certainly should be the precursor. If you've done a self-report, it's much easier to deal with a non-trial resolution or a deferred prosecution with a company that has done the self-report as opposed to one that hasn't. One that decides to fight the entire process, does not want to admit their responsibility, liability, but rather at the end of the day expects the state to prove everything beyond a reasonable doubt, as does occur. Now, you've seen this link between non-trial resolutions and incentives very effectively when one looks at the work that the Security and Exchange Commission of the US has done. And they publicize their results and the monies that are paid over to whistleblowers. It's actually publicized on their website. You can go onto it now and see what it is that they've done there. But part of the entire process for dealing with the non-trial resolution is if there has been a whistleblower report, how has that company dealt with the whistleblowing? And certainly those are all factors that go towards addressing how that company should be dealt with. And if you have systems, processes in place, which by the way, there isn't an obligation on any company in this country at the moment, and certainly not in terms of the Protected Disclosures Act to ensure is in place. So compliance programs, anti-corruption compliance programs internationally require you to have a dedicated whistleblower program that speaks to how, in fact, you will deal with the whistleblower allegation when it occurs internally and what measures are put in place in order to ensure that there isn't victimization of the whistleblower. Those are the types of things that you will need in place for there to be an effective non-trial resolution with a company.
Could I have a comment for each of one of you? What does the panel think of public recognition of whistleblowers? For example, Babita Deokaran International Airport. Cynthia, starting with you.
Thanks. Whistleblowers should be recognized and acknowledged and rewarded. It's something that at least shows that what they've done it for the public good and the public interest. In the case of Babita Deokaran, who's left a daughter who's currently now first year university, I think, her family supporting her getting through university. There's nothing else. And what is the country doing about it? So yes, I recommend it fully, and it needs to be done on an annual basis. Thank you. With a monetary award. Thanks.
Thank you. Many years ago, I was walking in Times Square with my son. We passed a van, and an hour later, we had that van actually had a bomb. And a hawker saw the smoke coming out of the van and blew the whistle. So whistleblowers are very important. In our country, if the media could show how much savings have we gained through whistleblowing, properly, the country will be amazed and shocked. And therefore, one of our requirements is that there must be a recognition of whistleblowing, and maybe even an international day for whistleblowers, and maybe even an award system where we can have awards for whistleblower of the year, people who've actually saved this country. In the past, those who fought for the Republic were treated as heroes and given awards. Nowadays, they get prison, they get fired, and they get victimized. Very crazy turn of events. So yes, we do need to recognize our whistleblowers much more effectively than we've been doing up until now. Thanks.
So it goes without saying, the more we exalt these heroes, the more we ensure that it becomes part of our DNA as a country, the more we will be able to be more effective in addressing corruption at the root level. If we change the culture of people, then certainly at the end of the day, the room higher up for corruption to thrive is limited or removed. So if you do not, at the end of the day, treat whistleblowers as the heroes that they are, we cannot change this perspective. So I'm all in favor of the recognition that should be given to these people. And I think that we need to ensure that we respect where they've come, what they've gone through, the struggles that they've gone through, but also at the end of the day, we need to publicize the successes that there have been as a result of what it is that they've done.
But can I add one thing? Yeah. I mean, sorry, Cynthia, for saying this to you, but let's take Cynthia's case. Zondo says Cynthia was basically victimized as a whistleblower, and she lost over 2 million rands. We took up the case of the commission, it hasn't moved. And how does SA explain itself as we speak now? There's a report there, nothing has happened. Where's the Minister of Public Enterprise? Where's the CEO where's the board of SAA? Whistleblowers, victimization. Thank you.
How can legislation be affected to ensure a clear separation between politically deployed public representatives at all levels, while ensuring independent financial governance oversight structures established across the state and government? Separation of deployees, political deployees, party deployees, versus the management and the finance management of companies and the state.
So it's very clear that we speak about political will. So if we speak about the political will to address corruption, we should be looking at merit. We should be looking at merit, and we should also be looking at persons being employed into these positions who at the end of the day are accountable. If you have a system where there isn't the separation between the political persona and what your responsibilities and duties are, you are always going to find that the challenges that we have with addressing corruption effectively are not, in fact, able to be achieved. So we have to ensure that when we speak about having contracts, performance contracts that people are judged against, that at the end of the day, it's clear what those performance contracts are. It's clear what is in that and what it is that needs to be accounted for. And then we need to have an independent body to which we have this accountability. And currently we use Parliament, but Parliament needs to actually have the teeth and use their functions more effectively to hold people and entities accountable in that space.
I support the call by Public Service Commission that we need a much more professional and dedicated civil servants who are loyal to the Constitution and the Republic, not political parties. In the corporate sector, we also need people who are committed to the Republic, not the bottom line. And I think we were to create a culture could actually succeed. Just look at the issue of what do they call it now? Looting of our resources, cables and stuff like that. A lot of these things happen in full view of the people. But due to the lack of incentive of reporting this, even if they report, nothing happens. And we can basically change the culture by making sure that we are more committed to the Republic. And I think we need to ask ourselves, what does being a South African mean, whether you're in corporate sector or public sector?
Are financial incentives for whistleblowing not a double-edged sword, i.e., discrediting of whistleblower motives and encouraging frivolous complaints as opposed to full compensation?
So I don't believe that incentivizing this will, in fact, create the situation where you're going to be having frivolous complaints and the like. If you've got an independent agency, they will be very quickly able to root out where the truth lies and where it does not. But at least you'll have a space and place where at the end of the day, everything will be investigated and dealt with. And if you look at the US system, what happens is that the incentives are not paid upfront. The incentives happen on the successful finalization of the matter. So at the end of the day, whether it's part of a non-trial resolution or a criminal case that unfolds, or at the end of the day, finding the evidence to show that disciplinary steps need to be taken internally because mechanisms are not being followed, but there is a positive outcome. But where there's a positive outcome as a result of the information that is provided, then that aspect then kicks in the incentives. So, but having said that, you need an independent agency to investigate that. You need an independent agency to be in a position to deal with that. You can't have an incentive system where it lies internally for these things to be dealt with, because we've seen through practice how easily it can be dismissed, or even the information is given through internally, and then a defense is almost built up to counter what the whistleblowers will in fact state.
I would say yes, it should be handled with care, but it's very important. As I was saying earlier on, if we keep on paying informers out of the police budget, why not paying whistleblowers in a management? Of course, we know what happened with Richard Mdluli and abuse of those monies, but surely we can address that. So yes, we have to incentivize whistleblowers because it's really important for what we want to achieve. Many people in this country get rewarded for fighting for the Republic except whistleblowers. So what is the difference? Whistleblowers from Mars and everywhere else is from Venus? Thanks.
Malini, I suspect you've answered this one, but I don't want to, in case it's something else. Noting Cynthia's point of protecting whistleblowers through anonymity, how would this impact the evidential value of the disclosure, specifically when taken up by SAPS or MPA?
Okay. So you heard me indicate that ideally you want to be able to have a parallel investigation. And if you treat a whistleblower who states to you very clearly, I do not want to testify, they are giving you information. So you treat the information exactly as you would in any other circumstance. And that is why I favor us using SIU or the Public Protector's Office. Because remember, we need a certain standard within SAPS or the NPA. There has to be information under oath before you can actually be in a position to register a criminal complaint. And if you cannot use the whistleblower as your witness, your A1, or the person who gives a statement under oath, you'll need to rely on the investigative powers of other agencies. So this is why you need to work closely with them. In that instance, we hand over to that agency, the SIU or Public Protector, because they do have investigative powers to be able to deal with information, and then using, and especially because the information relating to maladministration involving government departments in particular, they are in a position to go into those spaces and do the necessary investigations, gather the evidentiary material, and then present it to SAPS and the NPA for us to be able to take those cases forward. The challenge that you have is with the private sector. Now, what do we do with the private sector? And that's where that ombudsman that we're speaking about, that has got investigative powers, or the use currently of CIPC. The Companies Act has probably the most powerful tools in place. And if you look at internationally, the SEC, the number of legislation that they actually deal with, Financial Conduct Sector Authority in the UK and other countries, where you've got this umbrella legislation that deals with companies, surely there should be an enforcement space where you can deal with something like this. So I'm saying that when we craft this, we need to see how we address the private sector more effectively as well, because currently I think we do have enough to deal with whistleblowers and the translation of information into evidence through the entities that are there. But certainly it is seriously lacking in the private sector.
Just briefly, there was discussions last year that the GSC should also have a whistleblower unit. I don't know how far they've gone, because certainly one discomfort one had with the Zondo Commission was as if state capture is confined largely to the public sector. It's happening big time in the private sector. Whistleblowing is also happening, victimizing is also happening there. So there's definitely a need for the private sector to get more involved in this matter. And I think that unit in the GSC, which will be focusing on whistleblowing in the corporate sector, will be quite a useful thing. So I'm hoping a prof there, Kachalia, will have a discussion with the corporate sector to see how can JSC and other entities play a greater role in the support for whistleblowing in view of the importance of whistleblowing in the fight against corruption and abuse of power in the country.
We have 3 minutes left, so just 2 questions. Do we have examples of whistleblowers in South Africa specifically, whether it's private or public sector, who have sued the state, successfully sued the state?
Not that I'm aware of, because it's been so hard. Many have had, the whistleblowers I've been working with, many have had a case to take forward and sue the state or sue major organizations like the banks, for instance. But their case is prescribed. The lawyers don't want to take their cases because they all, it's a conflict of interest. And so the poor whistleblower has to pick up the dregs of his life and start somewhere else. And so, yes, no one has done, not that I'm aware of yet. Thank you.
I could think of 2, Cynthia. One is a SARS case. I remember that that lady was a whistleblower because she opposed the restructuring of SARS through Bain, but then they won in the labor court, and then SARS wanted to appeal. They lost the appeal, and then they got reinstated. The other one we had was the one of Mr. Bilana, which we took as a commission. But then, unfortunately, when he got to labor court of appeal, he was told, settle, and he took a settlement of 10 months. And end of the story, because he could not afford to fight his case beyond that. Actually, we wanted to go to constitutional court to say, but it's unacceptable. How does government violate its own act? But unfortunately, there are very, very few successful cases that we know which have actually gone. And we're hoping at some point in time we'll end up at the constitutional court. Maybe then the court will clarify this area of law for everybody else.
We've run out of time. I just want to thank the panel. I think the topic is very lively. It is absolutely critical, because if I look at the number of questions that this panel have received compared to the others, I think that this is a real live topic, relevant today, will become more relevant in the next few weeks and months, and it needs urgent attention. People's lives are at stake, and South Africa's future is at stake, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. That early Easter bunny present in your goodie bag, the Confronting the Corrupt book, has got an interesting passage in it about the experience in Schleswig-Holstein in Germany, where a retired police chief, or you could say in South Africa, a retired judge, is given the job simply by contract with the state. In other words, you could do a contract tomorrow with retired judges willing to do so, to be the ombud who interposes himself in any whistleblowing situation in which confidentiality and protection of identity is a prerequisite. And the way it works in Schleswig-Holstein is set out in the chapter on it, and it seems to be an informal solution to the problems of whistleblowers in South Africa that could be put in place immediately if the political will to address the issue could be generated. So don't miss that input from Wolfgang Pistel, who attended the first Cape Town conference on this topic of countering the corrupt. We now have a break for lunch. We return to where tea was served, and we reconvene at 10 to 2. I'm saying 10 to 2 because the people watching in cyberspace do not expect us to start before 2 o'clock. And so our next session, which is the session on NTRs, is scheduled for 2 o'clock. And just in case the majority of people in this webinar are expecting us to stick to the schedule that we've advertised, we've come back on schedule rather remarkably in this panel. And so we are going to be disciplined, and we are going to be in the room by 2 o'clock. There's plenty of time for lunch and plenty of time for discussion. And thank you for your attention. I did not see a single attendee fall asleep, which I suspect is a function of the efficiency of the air conditioning, as well as the quality of the panels we've had this morning. Thank you.